Most logging railroads in the American West were dangerous. That was simply part of the job. They ran through forests that had never seen rail before, across steep terrain, on track that was meant to be temporary. Accidents were expected, wrecks were frequent, and many of these railroads vanished almost as quickly as they appeared. But some logging railroads were dangerous in a very different way, not because they were reckless, not because they were poorly run, but because they combined scale, terrain, and industrial pressure in a way that quietly pushed both men and machines to their limits, day after day, year after year. Simpson Logging was one of those railroads. It wasn't the most chaotic logging operation, it wasn't the most primitive, and it wasn't the most short-lived. It was dangerous because it worked too well for too long under conditions that were never meant to support that level of operation. Most logging railroads had one major risk factor. Simpson had all of them at once. Most logging railroads were small by design. They were built quickly, used lightly, and torn up once the timber was gone. Their trains were short. Their locomotives were geared engines designed to crawl uphill with manageable loads. Everything about them assumed temporary use. Simpson Logging broke that pattern. Over its lifetime, the company built and operated hundreds of miles of railroad across Washington and Oregon. These weren't isolated spurs feeding a single camp. They were extended systems feeding large industrial mills that ran continuously. Simpson Logging didn't just rely on geared locomotives. They ran large shays, climaxes, and heislers, and at times, mainline-style rod locomotives. Pulling long, heavy log trains designed to keep mills fed at industrial scale, this mattered. Logging railroad track was never designed for that kind of traffic. The rails were lighter, the ties were smaller, the ballast was often minimal or improvised. As Simpson Logging grew, the trains got heavier faster than the infrastructure improved. The locomotives were powerful enough, the crews were skilled enough, but the track and braking systems were being asked to perform beyond their original design limits. The railroad didn't fail immediately. It absorbed the risk quietly. That's what made it dangerous. Geography made everything worse. Simpson operated primarily in the coastal mountains of Washington and Oregon, regions defined by steep grades, dense forests, and terrain that drops quickly toward tidewater and mill sites. Many logging railroads elsewhere solved steep terrain creatively. They used switchbacks to limit downhill speed, cable inclines to control descent, short downhill runs that ended quickly. But Simpson didn't have that luxury. Their lines frequently featured long, continuous downhill grades, cut rapidly through timbered terrain. Curves followed the contours of hillsides. Escape tracks were rare or non-existent. Once a train crested a summit, it might face miles of uninterrupted descent. On paper, this was manageable. In practice, it meant the entire safety of the train depended on perfect speed control for the entire run. There was no safe place to stop into full brakes. There was no easy way to bail out, and there was often no margin for error. A logging train that started to run away on these grades would not stop gently. This wasn't recklessness, it was geometry. Braking technology lagged behind locomotive power. Early logging railroads relied heavily on hand brakes, early air brake systems, retainers used to manage downhill pressure, and crew judgment and experience. Simpson Logging continued running heavy downhill trains before modern freight braking standards even existed. In some cases, newer locomotives pulled older rolling stock. Brake systems were mixed across eras. Improvements were incremental rather than comprehensive. This created a quiet but persistent danger: brake fade. As brake shoes heated during long downhill runs, friction dropped. The harder crews worked the brakes, the less effective they became. Once that threshold was crossed, control could disappear rapidly. The system worked until it didn't, and when it didn't, crews had few options. Runaway trains weren't a daily occurrence, but they were a constant latent risk built into the operation. Simpson Logging wasn't a frontier operation scraping by. It was a corporate-scale lumber empire. The mills ran continuously. The railroads fed them non-stop. Downtime meant lost production, lost contracts, and lost money. This created a very different risk environment from smaller logging outfits. Instead of stopping operations at the first sign of trouble, marginal equipment stayed in service. Repairs were deferred when trains still ran well enough, and crews were expected to keep schedules. None of this required anyone to be reckless. It simply normalized danger. When something worked yesterday, it was expected to work today, even if conditions had changed slightly or wear had accumulated just a little more. Risk became procedural rather than accidental, and procedural risk is the hardest to see. Simpson Logging crews were highly skilled. Many engineers and brakemen knew every grade by memory, recognized subtle changes in train behavior, and controlled speed by feel, sound, and vibration. This experience prevented countless accidents, but it also hid how dangerous the system truly was. When skilled crews compensate for risky conditions successfully, danger becomes invisible. What looks safe is often just well-managed risk. Other logging railroads had spectacular wrecks, shut down quickly, left fewer records. Simpson Logging, on the other hand, survived long enough to document its operations, left detailed photographs, maps, and reports. It shows us just how close to the edge it routinely operated. It appears more dangerous because we can see it clearly. Logging railroads were meant to be temporary. Build the line, harvest the timber, pull the rails, move on. Simpson Logging didn't operate that way. The company expanded continuously, reused existing infrastructure, transitioned from temporary spurs into semi-permanent industrial railroads. Track originally laid for a few seasons of use ended up carrying heavy trains for decades. Bridges aged, grades settled, rails wore unevenly. None of this caused immediate failure, but it created hidden systemic danger, the kind that accumulates quietly until conditions align the wrong way. The railroad didn't collapse, it endured under strain.